Dr. Charlotte Smith is our Chief Clinical Officer. Craig DiTomaso is our Director of Early Career Development, and we'll all be happy to share our experience and expertise. And we appreciate your time for being here, and hopefully we're going to make it worthwhile for you. Next slide, please. So basically, we really want to convey how to use all of the knowledge that you've gained through your fellowship to your advantage when you look for a position. And it's going to be very much to your advantage, and we'll explain that at the macroscopic level and as well as at the granular level of what exactly advantage it gives you. Also to have some idea of the strategies that you can use to choose one job over the other, or for them to choose you if it's your preferred job over other candidates. And then lastly, we'll review a bit about how you really can dig in and try to create a position in a market or a location that you really want to live in. So next slide. So there are, if you really look at the literature, and so I'm going to present more of a macroscopic view, and Charlotte and Craig are going to become much more granular in information about what I'll review. But if you look across the country, what you're going to find is there's some fundamental tenets and themes of PM&R fellowships. And this includes, obviously, you want to find your purpose and passion for developing a specific area of study, because you're going to practice medicine for a long time, and you really need to love what you do to practice medicine for any degree of time. So that's a lot of soul searching that hopefully you all have been doing continuously along the way. We can't stress enough that it's really important to engage in mentorship as you look into fellowship positions, and also as you go into practice, whether it's academic or whether it's private practice. Traditional fellowship mentors include your instructors, your professors, your attendings, but also a lot of support for mentorship comes from your peers and their experience and their knowledge base. And then there are coaches that basically are development experts that have a good view of what's happening across the country with respect to employment of fellowships in the process, and the details that you need to know to make that transition smoother for you. Clearly, you're going to need to know how to do research funding. One slide back, Joe. Yes, thanks. And then you need to know how to land a job. That's a whole separate process in itself. And then equally important to the other four is you need to have a pathway and a trajectory or a runway on how you're going to protect your time to reach your personal goals with your family and friends and your hobbies. Next. So if we look at the PM&R fellowships, and this is from the year 2020, the world has changed completely with respect to what residents do when they leave their program. 74% of residents matched in fellows. So that's almost 8 out of 10. 80% of the fellows were in pain or spine or sports, which means about 20% of them went otherwise into brain injury or hospice or neuromuscular or spinal cord injury or peds. So you have about 20% more inpatient oriented and 80% more outpatient oriented. So interestingly enough, 62% of the residents plan to go into a fellowship the day they walked into their residency program. So they were thinking about it well in advance. And half of those planned at that time to go into pain, spine, or sports. And 72% didn't change their mind from the day they walked into their residency to the day they left their residency. They stayed in a certain subspecialty focus. Next. So at the present time, Cleveland Clinic did an evaluation of their fellows, and this was in 2020. And they looked at their current graduates, from one day out of fellowship to several years out of fellowship. And they found over the course of time, more recently, fellows have been entering non-academic practices for a number of reasons. as they did their surveys of their grads, there was an improved job market. The opportunities for job creation were better. And the interesting thing is they found there was equal job satisfaction whether the patients went into academics or non-academics. And so basically the Cleveland Clinic's view, as it is now, is that they encourage graduates to consider both academic and non-academic practice equally, which to me makes a lot of sense. Next. So I just wanted to, in all fairness, you need to have eyes wide open, whatever direction you choose. So this is a graph that shows the percentage difference in lifetime revenues with private practitioners. So if you look at a full professor, if someone stays a full professor for their entire career versus going into private practice, their average lifetime revenue accumulation is 15% more in private practice than academics. If you look at the other side of the coin, if they become assistant professors over time in the academic sphere, and you compare them to the same amount of time getting to a private practice level of career reputation and comfortable with the level of services and the volume of services, that difference over the life of the practitioner is a 40% increase of revenues. So we need practitioners in both academics and private practice. People do need to consider that over time, their love for teaching and their research is fantastic, but they will give up a bit on the revenue side over the course of a lifetime of one's career. Next. So there are a lot of job search opportunities, and these are all the job search opportunities. If you look at the literature, everyone's using one or more of these, usually multiple sites. So there's online job centers, the Academy has one, email distribution lists. Word of mouth is a very large component of fellowship job search, especially if you know the geographic area. But even if you don't, it makes it a little more difficult. Prior connections with other job search distributions. A huge number of people take the advice of their program leadership, which makes perfect sense. At least the leadership will know the area, and many of them will know other areas in the country from their colleagues' practices. A lot of institutions try to assist their fellows in the job search, not all equally. And there's information that's gained from the prior fellowship graduates, wherever they are. Obviously, they're the alumni, so they know what's happening in the areas that they're working in, and that is extremely valuable information that should be collected in a very thorough job search analysis for yourselves. So as far as the challenges, there's lots of challenges. Just getting information on what's the best possible position, who has a good reputation, who doesn't, who has a good business organization, who doesn't, who has good research dollars, who doesn't. The list goes on. There's a lot of learning about the best available positions. Lack of mentorship on the process, we talked about that, and that's so critical. You almost need a concierge guide to help you along the way, because there's lots of processes that Charlotte and Craig will go over that you're going to have to do to get from residency at post-fellowship and into a fellowship position successfully. And the other thing too, we're all busy people. There's a lack of sufficient time for you to do all that and finish your fellowship and take care of your family's needs. And time is precious in the U.S. today for all of us. There's also, among all candidates, whether they're fellows or whether they're residents, there's a lack of preparation on negotiation skills. And there's definitely a need for more training in negotiation and interviewing. There's no question about that. Everyone at every level of PM&R is hungry for getting better at negotiation, not just for themselves, but for advocacy of their patients as well. And then there's a need for career development monitoring. Here you are at point A. Well, where do you want to go? And what are the steps up and down to get there, at least ideally, even if it's a 2-year plan, even if it's a 3-year plan. The mentoring really can help with, well, what can I accomplish in 2 years or 3 years? Next. So some of our observations from U.S. Physiatry, since we're a national company, we have physiatrists throughout the country. We have fellowship-trained physiatrists throughout the country. Clearly, what we've seen is there's been an increasing number of interventionalists who've joined our group either to leave interventional or diversify their practice or to maintain their inpatient skills. Those are the reasons we most frequently get. But we've had a real bump in those that want to be broad-based, or they don't like interventional as much as they liked. We obviously have been seeing a bump in fellowship-trained physicians come into private practice, either as medical directors or staff physiatrists, and their skills are highly valued in that geographic area, in any geographic area. And we're talking about on the private practice side as well as the academic side. But there's no question from our immediate experience, inpatient care needs and demands for inpatient-oriented physiatrists, whether they are graduates that decided not to do a fellowship, or more especially if they're fellowship trained. They are so many positions available: clinical, medical director, and system leadership positions. Those leadership positions, all of those positions are skyrocketing in number. So the demand is great. And so that's good news for everyone here, but it's almost, there's so much opportunity. You really need some help to sort it out, some guidance. So in the best of all possible worlds, you'd have a concierge guided job search, right? Someone who knew the playing field, who knew the players, who knew the background, know the in-depth information about a practice or an organization or an academic center. That would be ideal, right? And also we're able to help connect you with mentors. And also we're able to give you interviewing skills. And essentially you're teaming up with career development specialists. And it's becoming much, much more essential because those of us in U.S. Physiatry in leadership and development really are engaged in all of those processes I just mentioned regarding a concierge guided job search out of necessity to help P&R physicians navigate. So fellowship trained physicians, no question, are highly sought after for staff and leadership roles throughout the post-acute continuum of care, whether it's acute, whether it's a long-term acute health hospital, LTAC, whether it's a skilled nursing facility for subacute rehab. The needs are very great, and the positions are really going to grow, especially as the baby boomer population grows, which is doing right in front of our eyes, and fills all of those post-acute care continuum facilities. Next. So I'm going to hand it over to Charlotte Smith, who was just amazing at giving you granular information and really practical guidance on how to continue to navigate as you transition away from training and into the real world of PM&R care. Charlotte.
Thank you, Mike. Well, first of all, congratulations to everybody on this call that's made it this far in their career pathway. It's not an easy thing. You know, getting into PM&R is challenging, and getting into these fellowships is very competitive. And I think all of you that are at this place are really well positioned for fantastic careers. The opportunities have never been better. And if everything that we are trying to accomplish, both at US Physiatry and with the American Academy of Physical Medicine Rehab happens, Physiatry is positioned to be the leaders in the healthcare continuum. And so it's very exciting. So wherever you end up in any role, any level of care, we need you. And we're excited to have you join us. So you're part of the Physiatry team. And I think what you're going to find as you talk with people is most everybody you meet that's out there in the field, or people like us at US Physiatry or other leaders of groups, you know, we're happy to help. It's a very collegial thing. It used to be a situation where people were very intimidated and threatened if there were other physiatrists coming to town. And what's been proven time and time again, the more physiatrists there are, the more demand there is for physiatry. Because our biggest challenge is getting the word out with what we do so that people are aware of us. So you should find wherever you go, people willing to help you and support you. And if you don't, something's very wrong because that's how it should be. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about this from two perspectives. I'm obviously pretty far out from my training, but I have had to reinvent myself many times. And I'm going to talk about this both as someone who's found jobs and created jobs for myself in a variety of settings and had to transition different ways, but also someone who's hired a lot of doctors over the years and had to find partners, whether they were formal partners or pseudo partners, or actually people that were working with a group that I was with. And what I've seen is there are 3 times or situations where groups or entities are really hungry and looking for physiatrists with expertise. And the 3 times are generally, one, when they're starting up something new, like a new program or a new facility, especially if they're going against some very intense competition in the market, or they have an established facility and they're doing so well they need help because their doctors are too busy, or they're adding satellite locations because there's huge demand. The third scenario, I'm not going to talk about as much. Oh, go back, please. Go back to the other slide. The third scenario is when you've got a turnaround situation where you have a facility that's not doing very well, it's crashing and burning, and the occupancy's low, maybe the reputation's low, patient satisfaction's low, and they can't find anybody. That's also an opportunity sometimes for a physiatrist to come in, and they will pay you a lot of money. I would encourage all of you not to take that as your first job. Having done several turnarounds in my life, I can tell you it's not for the faint of heart, but that's where a lot of times the big bucks come in. But let's talk about the easier ones. So like a new and startup facility, what they're looking for a lot of times is something to differentiate them and give them advantage of their competition. So they're looking for expertise that's very specific. Sometimes it might be brain injury, or neurosciences is very hot. It might be spine, it might be pain, but they're looking for expertise in how to set up and grow a specialty program that gives them an advantage in the market. And what's really kind of cool is, having been in a lot of community hospitals, they get really intimidated when somebody walks in or rolls in and they're a new spinal cord injury, or, any kind of a neuro, or even if they're a complex like pain situation. And having somebody that comes from a top program or a model systems that has those skills and has done it a lot brings a lot to the table. And it's not just to the table in terms of patient management, but it's also what we call program development. And what program development is not just taking care of patients, it's helping the facility set up protocols and assist with staff training and education. Because you can come in and you can write lots of orders, or, make lots of suggestions, but if the team that you're working with doesn't understand what to do, you're going to be unsuccessful most of the time. So it's a very different role, and program development clearly is something that's valued by most facilities. It's something that they're often willing to pay for. Because it does take time that may or may not be compensated. And then the third thing they're looking for is someone to help market their programs. And when we start talking about marketing, most physiatrists get very uncomfortable. But the truth is, most all of you have done marketing without realizing it, because what marketing typically is, a lot of times, is education. And I cannot tell you how many educational talks and presentations and, team meetings I've done over the decades, where essentially what I was doing was teaching them what I do, but it was marketing, because the buzz gets out there that you're a good doctor and you know what you're doing. And if people like, what you have to say, they're going to refer you patients or want to join your team. And so that's really what marketing is all about. It's education. And that's really an important thing. And most all of us have those competencies, but don't realize it. So that's huge. And, finding a program can find a doctor that's willing to put their face out there and do public talks or speak at medical staff meetings or other, forums. That is a huge asset to them, because there's so much more credibility and power when you have a physician talking about something than if you have an administrative person. So that's very cool. Now, the established facilities may be very different. you can imagine that if you look at this first thing about the new startup facilities, you're kind of a lone ranger. You're going to go in and be doing a lot of stuff on your own. Whereas the second scenario, which is an established facility, is typically you've got doctors there in place and man, they're going full guns. They're doing really well, but it may be like a 3-month wait to get into their office because they're so successful. Or it may be they're busting out of their facility because they have so many patients they need to like do a satellite. But their program is so successful and they're doing so well that they really don't have enough bandwidth. And if you walk into a situation like that, generally speaking, the model's built. They're probably pretty educated. They have the expertise. It's going to be a different situation. You're walking in and you're basically one of them and one of the team, and it's going to be set up well. And it may be a situation like my husband. My husband's a general surgeon. When he started practice, his most difficult dilemma was whether to frame his diplomas in wood or metal. And if he did metal, whether it was silver or gold. Whereas I was like, getting a line of credit and, figuring out protocols and hiring people and buying office furniture. So I mean, the first scenario, you may be doing a lot of stuff on your own. The second scenario, not so much. Next slide, please. So here's the funny thing and the shocking thing, and this was humbling to me. So I had my first interview, and it wasn't really an interview because it wasn't a job. I wasn't offered a job, but I was basically going into Austin, Texas, where I wanted to work. I was born and raised there, and I was told by the other physiatrist there at the time that they didn't need any more physiatrists, that this town wasn't big enough, and he had, he's got it covered. He didn't really need any partners or anybody else competing against him, which was kind of discouraging. But I sort of did some networking and found out who the major players were. And it was really a neurosurgeon in town who was the executive director of the trauma hospital and was very well positioned in the whole medical community. And I started networking with the medical society and with him and ended up getting a dinner invitation that was essentially an interview with him and 5 other neurosurgeons that were in his group. And so they sit me down at the table and they asked me why they would want to work with me. And, I was trying to be humble and I basically explained that the hospitals where I'd worked out were world famous and I'd been under incredibly smart faculty and learned a lot of skills. And back in this time was doing pretty innovative stuff like Botox and baclofen pumps. And this is like, late 80s, early 90s. And just what we were able to do with brain injury. And they were really wanting to go to neurosciences. So I thought this would, be exciting to them. And, I really was just talking about the specific things that I'd learned and, just how it helped people and how great these programs were. And, how I saw huge opportunities for Austin, Texas to have similar types of services for patients there and how it helped people. And there was a dead silence after I presented all this. I didn't talk that long. It was like maybe 5 or 10 minutes, And then this neurosurgeon looked at me very seriously and he says, "Young lady," he goes, "do you know what that's worth in Austin, Texas?" And I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Less than the price of a cup of coffee." And I was like, "Really?" And he's like, "Yes." He goes, "You know what's going to make you successful in Austin, Texas?" And I was like, "What?" He goes, "If you work well with us, because ultimately all that stuff sounds really good, but it won't happen unless you work well with us and you're part of our team." And, I went into the bathroom and cried for a while and then I freshened up my makeup and I came out. So then I asked him, "Well, what would it take, to work well with you? You need to teach me." And what was interesting, we had a great partnership for the next 20 years, and they did make me successful and got to do everything I wanted to do. But what they were looking for was someone who was a team player, coming in and talking about all the expertise you have and all the things they're going to expect you to have that if you come from a good program. But what they want is somebody that's reasonable to have to deal with on a daily basis and someone that's going to help them with their needs and invest in their program and, be able to play well with others. And what that looks like a lot of times is the same thing we talked about last slide, which is being able to communicate well and educate well. And the thing that I realized right off the bat, and I've seen this over the years, is those skills are just as important as the expertise that you bring to the table, maybe in a subspecialty area. And I've seen so many physiatrists that are very, very well trained. I mean, incredibly well trained, good doctors. But for whatever reason, the other piece, which is the communication, the being able to, really be bold and promote what you do and work well with a team and be a leader, harder. And even though they were outstanding in their skill sets, they were maybe possibly not as successful in their career. So I just want you guys to remember that. I mean, that's the foundation. All of this stuff is the foundation. And without the foundation, all of the skills on top of it most likely won't be as well utilized. Next slide, please. So, the question is, how do you target your search? And what I've heard about many scenarios is that you can have it all, just not at all at the same time. And I think that's really true. When I came to Austin, I told them I really love spinal cord. And they're like, well, good luck with that. You're never going to have a full-time spinal cord practice here in town because we're not big enough. That's just not going to happen. You have to do everything. I was like, okay. But what was interesting is by the end of my time there, I was doing a full-time spinal cord clinic with a neuro recovery program and major, fundraising from the community. And I mean, it was fabulous. And I was able to do that. I was also told, you can't really ever be a sports medicine doctor unless you do a fellowship in sports medicine. Well, there was no such thing back in the day, but I ended up being the medical director for the marathon in Austin and a consultant for the University of Texas for over a decade. So one of the things I'll tell you is they may say you can't do something, but one of the basic principles is if you get your foot in the door and you do well with what you're given, you have the opportunity to expand your territory. And, the goal that you want to do essentially is you want to be so successful that you have a waiting list or people wanting you and you have more demand than you have capacity. And then what you can do is shape your energies and what you focus on to the things you like. And then you can bless your colleagues by giving them some things you can't handle. And what that does is that helps you fine tune your search. So, we'll hear from people that come out and they're like, oh, I only want to do, whatever, EMGs, or I only want to do this or that. In today's healthcare environment, that may not be feasible. I mean, if you're getting hired in an academic program or a large group where they only want you to do EMGs, yes, of course. But if you came to Austin just as I did, if I had said I only want to do EMGs, I would have been bankrupt. And it just, you have to really think about your timing and everything, and you can't have it generally all at the same time. So you've got to figure out what are your priorities. For me, I knew I wanted to go to Austin. That's where I was from. And I was willing to take less of a salary. I was willing to work harder. I was willing to start at the bottom, because that's what I wanted. I could have probably, gone someplace else and made a lot of more money at the beginning and had it be easier. But, that was the priority. And I get some residents and fellows who that's where they are too. They're like, I want to be in this place. And that's great. It's just you have to recognize that in that place, you may have a different opportunity set than if you go to another place. Some people are so in debt, because of student loans and have to really have a high salary. And that's okay, because there are jobs that you can take that are guaranteed high salary. They may not be as desirable. They may not be in the location that you want to be. And you may not get to do exactly what you want to do. But I know people who have taken jobs where they actually went to a market where they couldn't find anybody and worked 1 year and made enough money in 1 year to pay off all their student loans. And they're like, I can do anything for 1 year. Why not? And it worked for them. It was great, good strategy. And then they were free to kind of do whatever they wanted to the rest of the time of their career. The other one would be, whether or not you're willing to be flexible, because there's some specialties, that if you only want to do, say, for example, spinal cord injury, it may not be feasible. You may have to do a lot of other things too. And some people don't want to do that. They want to do what they want to do. And, it just depends on kind of what you really are focused and motivated to do. And then the last one is, you guys heard me talking earlier on these slides, and I'm talking about the two scenarios of the new startup facility versus established. You might imagine that different personality types are better or worse in either of those scenarios. So, if you're someone like me who was kind of a wild person who just, likes taking risks, and I sort of like being my own boss, and I really, wanted the opportunity to just create something. And I was able to do that. Just my situation was such that I could. That first scenario of starting something new was a great one. Other people are like, no, I'd really rather have something where I have more support and more hand holding, and I kind of show up and I know what my job is and I do it each day and I go home. And, and both are okay. There are needs for both. And it may even be that in your career, you do different ones. I certainly have. So, but you have to know your own personality and what makes you happy. And then decide, okay, out of these four things, what is my biggest priority? And then work from there. Otherwise, you're going to get overwhelmed and confused, just like going to job fairs or trying to figure out like, where do I even start in terms of finding a place? But, you put the big rock in the jar first and then let the other ones, and then recognize, you may have to compromise. Most people are not going to stay in the same job most of their lives, except for Mike Lupinacci, of course. But most people change jobs multiple times. And it may be that early on you have to pick because of one variable being more important than the others, like its location or salary. But you always have the opportunity to morph, whether it's in that same position, as you grow and evolve, or maybe a new job. Next slide. So there's things to look out for, and I'm not going to go into the depth of contracts, although I can tell you there's a lot to that, and I'm learning more and more, and it's fascinating because the same things come up over and over. But when you look out for your first job, I think more than just the salary or just, the location of the benefits, the things you really, really want to be sure of is that you're going to be in a place where they have needs that you're able to meet. My hypothesis has always been that, people who meet needs will always be needed. And that's how our specialty has always been since the beginning. And so my number one big thing is, I want to go someplace where they have a big need that I can meet. Because if I'm willing and able to meet that need, there's growth potential. Because that's the other one. You don't want to go into a job, unless it's just, if you want to grow and you want to have a career that keeps expanding, you want to work with an organization that has growth potential. Hugely important. And not all jobs have that. You also want one that has a healthy culture. And, it may be hard to figure that out, but there are some jobs that just, it's hard for anybody to be successful there because of some of the variables that are involved. And then there's some that are so happy and healthy that pretty much everybody there improves and rises. And that's the kind of group that I look for, and I think is a good thing. The bad things are just the opposite. If you see a place and you're applying for a job and they've had like, 3 people in the last 2 years in that job that have left, and you're stepping in, you have to go, okay, what am I going to do better or different to make this successful? Or why are all these people leaving? What's the secret here? Is it bad? Or is there something else? Is it just not a feasible job description? There's something not right here. And then also the other one, this is the fatal error that gets so many people, is, knowing that a lot of times when you go into a job, you may not stay there the rest of your career and you may have to leave. You do not want to be locked down into something that's so inflexible you don't have other options and you're backed into a corner. And the biggest one that causes a lot of trouble is restrictive covenant. And that's where you go to work for one group in town and you may have a clause that says that like for the next 3 years, you can't work within 100 miles of the city. Well, that could be a real problem, especially if you have a spouse that's tied to that town. And what I have seen is the trend towards restrictive covenants being overly broad has gotten much bigger. And it's gotten more ominous as we've gotten more of these employed physician and corporate roles. It used to be with small groups, this was an issue, but you could negotiate around it. Now a lot of these places are like, this is restrictive covenant, this is our contract, take it or leave it. If you don't want it, we can replace you. Now, we're a little more fortunate in physiatry because there really is a need for us. What I will say to you is you can negotiate restrictive covenants. A lot of times it's essentially, rather than saying, what can I do? You say to them, what is your fear? What is your concern? And every time I've ever done that, where I go, like, what is it you really don't want me to do? Because what I don't want is a situation where you can't practice any kind of medicine at all. And what they don't want is they just don't want you to do something to hurt them. I mean, and they also, in a sense, sometimes will use this to keep you in a role so you can't leave. So I think the key thing is figuring out and trying to put it in language that you both can live with, as opposed to something that's overly broad. There are attorneys who get involved in this, and a lot of these restrictive covenants are kind of not upheld, but you're talking lots of money and a lot of pain and a lot of attorneys to get to that point. So it's better to try to fix that up front if you can. Next slide. So how do you create a job that doesn't exist or isn't advertised? And I can tell you, at least for me, that's been the vast majority of my jobs, where I've showed up someplace and there was no formal job description, nothing advertised. There was a group that didn't even know they needed a physiatrist. They didn't know what it was. And then also I've had people who've shown up that kind of like could see how busy I was. I have one of my partners who I adored, who he tried to call me for like 2 or 3 months to just, meet me because he wanted to come and join my practice and heard, be someone good to work with. And I literally just was so busy. I was working like 18-hour days. I was keeping about 40 people in the hospital. I had a half-day clinic 4 days a week. And I mean, even opening my mail and my emails was like just overwhelming. I was just way too busy. And literally, he instructed my administrative assistant to put his resume on my chair so that I came in, I had to see it. And then he just showed up one day and said, "Hey, I'm taking you to lunch," which was kind of funny. And I mean, he just, basically made himself available. And then he was extremely helpful and useful in some things. And I was like, okay, when do you want to start? And he could see that because I was so busy, there was a lot of business that somebody could step up and help with. And it was fantastic, and I've had, several people like that you just meet them and they're going to be so good, and that there's really good chemistry, and you are just like so willing to create a position for them. So one of the things you have to do is you've got to study the market. If you know where you want to be, like I did, one of the things that's helpful is to find out, do some espionage and find out who has the best reputation in that town. And there's a lot of ways you can find out. You can ask people in that town if you know anyone. You can ask people, your fellow, um, your professors where you are in your program, your fellowship director. You can ask them, and you find out, number one, who's best in town, and number two, how long does it take to get an appointment there? And that's a pretty easy thing to do. You can call the office and say, "Hey, I'd like to refer a patient. How far are you guys booked out?" And if they say 3 months, "Oh, thank you so much. I got to get someone in sooner, but thank you." The further they're booked out, the more of an opportunity there is, perhaps. You also, if you can possibly swing it, meeting people face to face and asking to shadow them is great. I know it's very hard to get rotations, or time off to see people, but sometimes it's worth even just taking a vacation day, calling somebody up and saying, "Hey, I'm a fellow in this. I'm, super, super impressed with your practice. I've heard so many good things. Would it be possible for me to shadow you for one day and just, pick your brain while we're shadowing? I'll be useful to you." And a lot of times, if you meet someone, it's similar like when you're trying to get a residency and you come as a medical student to a rotation. It does give you a leg up, but it also gives you a chance to see if you like them and see from a gut level, is this a good program or a bad, place to work? And it's helpful on both ends. You also can see needs that aren't being met or problems that need to be solved. And then from that, you can help them, which is great, and propose a role. And I've done that so many times, and it's been really helpful. It's just a matter of being a student and seeing. One thing I will say to you right now in healthcare is there are no shortages of needs, and almost every group or organization or institution has got some pressure points where they need help. And someone that comes in and is willing to try and help them with their problems is rarely turned down. And I think a lot of times coming out of fellowship or training, we don't think from that perspective. We're more about kind of, this is what I need and I want. But the paradox is that if you can look into what they need and how you can meet that need, you're going to get a better deal. That's just the way it is. And then how do you find these good deals and do this? The PM&R network is very tight. We all know each other. And you can ask around, you can ask your attendings or people that are faculty, people that to make introductions for you. And generally, they're happy to do that. I'm a big fan of the County Medical Society because every county medical society has a new member committee. They also always have a president who's usually a doctor who's trying to get people to join their organization. And it's a very easy thing to call them and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about coming to town. I'm in physiatry. Who do you think is the best physiatrist in town? Who do you like to work with?" And they'll give you a name. They're happy to do that. And then what you do is you can call that physiatrist and say, "Hey, I am a young, physiatrist that's looking to come to town. And I was talking to Dr., president of the Medical Society, and he said you are absolutely the best in town and that I should meet you." And that gets you in the door always, which people love to hear any encouragement and praise, especially from somebody that's a recognized leader who's respected. And it's okay to name drop in a circumstance like that. Next slide, please. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig, who is much closer to the experience of doing a fellowship and finding a job, and he's going to have some great information to share with you. Take it, Craig.
Sure, I'm going to have to talk really fast so we don't have much time left. But we'll find a way to cover a few things and get you guys some helpful information. So again, I'm Craig DiTomaso. I'm the Director of Career Physician Development for USP. Next slide. And this is just a little bit about me. My focus is on brain injury, and in particular, the most severe traumatic brain injury, including disorders of consciousness. I work at all levels of care and try and bridge the continuum, especially for my brain injured patients. I've done the academic thing, I've done private practice now, and so I think I'll have a little bit of a perspective for you from what I've seen. Next slide. So kind of 4 things I tried to sum it down for, I think, when you're looking at a job. Number 1, location, and we're going to make that a broad location. Number 2, resources. Number 3, opportunities and threats. And then finally, gut feeling, because I think that's what most people end up making that decision on. Next slide. So we're talking about location. Obviously, number 1 is geographic, and my brilliant counterparts, Dr. Smith and Dr. Lupinacci, covered that in great detail. But, you know, when you look at those geographic things, what really is important to you? Do you have to be in a particular city? Is there an urban versus rural split you're looking for? But anytime you make a concession, as they've already mentioned, for location, you're going to give something up, right? There is a concession involved there. And so you're going to have to feel for your individual situation, what's the right concession? How close to that ideal location do you have to be versus what things are negotiable and what can you give up? In addition, we're talking about location. Different locations have different cultures, and culture can be seen in a lot of different ways, right? I think one of the most important things is what's kind of the attitude to medicine location that you need to be in. Do you need to be in somewhere where medicine is the number 1 business, where people look up to doctors and it's a really important place? Or, you know, on the other end, are you okay if medicine's just another one? Here in Houston, we have such a huge oil and gas market. We have a very big booming service industry. And so then medicine is kind of in the mix. And certainly there's the largest in the world medical center here too, but it's one of many industries. And so medicine isn't always thought of as something unique or special. That varies depending on where you go in the country. And so oftentimes that's really important to people and something they don't think about. On the other end of that, you're going to have interactions based on that. So how does that go, right? Are you coming to a place where, again, physicians are super revered and you're going to be able to have a lot of power negotiating and getting what you want? Or are you on the other end where you're just another worker, a cog in the wheel? That's very cultural and dependent on the location. So try and figure that into your thinking about location to some degree. In addition, medical infrastructure, you know, what resources around to you? If you're going to be in the middle of a large city, there's probably going to be more resources, more medical infrastructure around you, and that can be helpful and important to some people. Likewise, some people do better when there's not as much organization. We'll talk more about that later. The con of that, of course, is if you go to a group with a lot of infrastructure and a lot of medical things, then there's already physicians around you. There's already people who are going to kind of be in your way, so to speak. And so how do you operate in those situations? Are you somebody who makes friends easily or not? That may factor into your location as well. And right, jumping along that, networking and friendship. You know, Dr. Smith was right on about the different medical societies. Certainly it's a great way to connect with other people, and we'll talk more about that later as well. But here I mean more about, you know, do you have friends, people maybe you went to med school or residency with around you? They're great referral sources. They can help you feel comfortable, give you the lay of the land. But on the flip side of that, they often have expectations. You know, are you going to stay in touch? Are you going to send them referrals back? Or are you going to play favorites with that? So those kind of location specific things may come into your mind. And there's no one right answer, but those are things I would encourage you to weigh as you're looking at this. Next slide. Oh, I think we went one too many, Joe. Sorry about that. There we go. Resources in general. And so I think, again, most of this has been covered by my brilliant colleagues. But number 1, if you're looking at a job, think about the hospital resources, right? If there's a hospital that has a lot of resources, that can be really helpful when needed. And some hospitals really go above and beyond to help their doctors out, especially when you're in a pickle. On the other end of that, big hospital systems, especially those with lots of resources, tend to have a lot of bureaucracy. And so are you somebody who's okay dealing with, you know, 5 levels of IT to get to where you need to go, or to get a different badge for every part of the hospital? Those things happen in bigger, more built out hospitals. They tend to be less important in the smaller ones. On the other end, what does the county and state medical group look like? As Dr. Smith mentions, that's a great place to start. In some places, they're great. They can be referrals. They can offer support. In other areas, they're not as big. So going back to the location, you have to maybe think about it if that's going to be key to your strategy. There are some negatives, I think, though, and we do need to mention that. They can be very expensive. They can be very inconsistent when they offer, and some of them have very high demands. So you'll need to think about that a bit. Patient volume, if you're somewhere that has a lot of the types of patients that you want to see, say you're a brain injury or spinal cord injury specialist, or a pediatric specialist, then being somewhere that has a high volume already kind of in the pipeline can be very advantageous for you. On the other end, if there is a high volume, oftentimes there are some high expectations with that. There's already some maybe not PM&R, but some related fields built around that. And so stepping into that, they're going to want you to kind of fit into their world and do the things that they do. On the other end, if the patient volume that you're specific to, especially after your fellowship, is low in volume, then I'm willing to bet they probably aren't getting expertise care, because nobody's picking up those few patients that come through. People don't even realize what can be done. But on the other end, you're going to need to really market yourself more. It's not being recognized. So you're going to have to go out there and educate people and spend time doing that. That can be a real drag when you're early in practice. Are you someone who's good at that? Again, you go out and talk well and make connections or not? Speaking of that, networking and mentorship, for people who do this well, this can be really fun and helpful. You can meet other people and kind of grow your social circle. But if you're more introverted, that can be maybe a negative as well. Also, the referrals that come back to you are very rarely a one-to-one relationship with how much time you spend networking and working on mentorship. Sometimes you spend a lot of time and you think you're building up a great friendship or mentorship or network, and you see almost nothing from it. Other times a chance encounter results in lots of referrals. And no one really knows, right? It's very individualized depending on the people involved, but it's something to think about. Next, I think a lot of people come out of academic programs, especially if you go to a fellowship and you have some interest or knack for teaching. And there's lots of ways to teach, right? You can teach medical students, residents, fellows, of course, but also nurses, therapists, clinical liaisons, community people. So there's lots and lots of ways to teach. I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. Despite being in private practice, I do an awful lot of teaching currently, and I think it's good because it keeps you sharp and stimulates your brain to keep learning. I will say, though, there is a negative, of course, in that it takes a lot of time and it doesn't typically pay well, if anything. Similar to research, right? If you're in a fellowship, they've probably forced you, if you're not into it, to do some research. Looking at the job, are you going to need to do research to stay on board, number one? If you want to just do it, you certainly can do it. Even from a private practice perspective, it is possible. And again, it helps you to keep sharp. It's stimulating. It can be important to the field, but it does take a tremendous amount of time, as everyone on this virtual meeting knows. And again, it doesn't pay anything. Next one. So, when you're trying to look at things, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try and make it quick, but oftentimes you look at things like a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and threats? So we can focus in on some really important opportunities and threats. Perhaps it'll give you a little bit of a guideline for evaluating the jobs that are in front of you. Again, number one, I would look at high patient volumes. That seems to be an opportunity because there's a chance for high productivity, but oftentimes it brings with it high competition. On the opposite end, an opportunity may be few physicians around. That's beneficial because there's low competition. It also means little resources, little mentorship, and little support if you do get into a pickle. Thinking about what the payer mix looks like around your job, and this is pretty high level, but if you're financially minded, knowing that there's a strong private insurance is often good because it results in high reimbursement. It also often comes with high demands. Currently, lots of peer-to-peer discussions, pre-authorizations, and lots of competition for those high-paying patients. On the other end, if there's a high Medicare or Medicaid population, you're almost guaranteed to have increased pathology. That's been shown in lots of studies, which is interesting and stimulating, and the patients are typically very grateful. On the other end of that, you do tend to have a little lower reimbursement from those, but not always. Similarly, we kind of covered this. If there's a strong physician or hospital group, oftentimes there's programs that you can step into and improve and feed off of, but there's often also less room to innovate. You're in a little more of a box because there's already physicians doing things and programs running. If you're in a weaker physician or hospital group or setting, then again, you have lots of room to create. You can probably do what you want to do, but it may result in increased disorganization, or it may fall on you to create the organization out of the chaos. So you have to see if you're someone who likes doing those things. Next slide, Joe. And finally, gut feeling. And I know this is really what it comes down to, everybody. What does your gut say? And I'll just give you a couple of points to think about as you're evaluating that gut feeling. Number one, a positive gut feeling or positive impression is oftentimes due to a happy environment. And that's a good thing, right? Because nobody wants to work in a negative environment. If your idea within that is that it's a good place to go, then you're probably off on the right foot. But just be careful, because sometimes it's just really good marketing. Sometimes they know how to get all of the happy people in front of you in the day or the half day that you spend there, and they keep the curmudgeons in the back. If there's a negative impression, sometimes it is just poor marketing. Sometimes that you just happen to go to a place and they don't have their ducks in a row for your interview that day, or someone's had a bad day, or it's snowing in Houston, as has happened to people before, and everything just seems to fall apart, And so the person may leave with a negative impression, but really it's not a bad place, or it could speak to larger issues. So it's tough to filter that through. Again, if your gut impression is that people there are happy, typically that does enforce a positive culture, and that's a positive thing. But remember, in happy places, it's usually because people are pretty set in their ways. They've kind of figured out how they do what they do. If you're going to come in there and try and innovate or change things, it may disrupt that. On the other end, if people seem unhappy, it could just be the result of some of those recent changes, right? People dealing with an organization that's evolving. And that may be a great place for you to step in and start to offer some organization and some building blocks. But it could also be very poor leadership. And so you have to be careful when you're looking at that. Finally, if the environment seems comfortable, that's a great thing, because you can kind of zoom right in there and start. It's a reason I think a lot of people look for jobs within their academic center or with neighboring academic centers. But sometimes that doesn't challenge you to grow and develop yourself, right? You're in a place where you already feel comfortable and you know how to operate. Sometimes the uncomfortable environment will allow you to push yourself to new heights, or learn things about you, innovate in a way that you might not have if you were in your little cocoon. On the other end, there are some places that just are bad fits. And if it's an uncomfortable environment, you may never really feel at home. And that's unfortunate, of course. No one right or wrong answer, but all things to consider. So we're just about out of time. I think that's my last slide, right, Joe?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I wanted to leave a little bit of time to talk, so I went through as fast as humanly possible. And we'll see if the audience has any questions for us, of course.
Thanks, Craig. Great job. Great job. And do we have a chat box here? If anybody wants to chat a quick question in, we have a couple of minutes, which is fine. I'm going to ask a question of Greg. So the environment that you practice in and the environment that I practice in are pretty much on opposite sides of the seesaw. Like, I'm in the country. We don't have a lot of physiatrists. We have no fellows practicing in the community. The demand is huge. What do you see in Houston? You obviously came, did your fellowship at Baylor, and then came out into private practice and assumed a medical directorship. And I'm assuming you do brain injury, but do you do general rehabilitation as well? And how did that work out for you? How did you feel about that?
Yeah, and I think Charlotte did a great job of really discussing this earlier, in that I think in private practice, that ability to be flexible is just so valued. While I've worked very hard to try and build up the brain injury referrals, and now I have almost an exclusively brain injury practice, especially to start that private practice wheel going, to get things going and get referrals and meet people. I certainly never turned down a referral or at least a consultation on a patient to try and get in there. So amputation, spinal cord injuries, everything short of pediatrics. I saw, and I still see from time to time. I cover consults, I cover skilled nursing, whatever needs done within my group. And I think that is a big differentiator from private practice to academics, and something that I think residents and fellows need to think about.
Right. And let's see, we have probably another minute, Charlotte. What's been your experience with fellows in recent years? Because when you and I were in residency, people rarely did fellowships. It was maybe at the most 1 in 20, and now it's 8 in 10. Have you had some recent experiences with fellows?
Yeah, I worked with a lot with them at the University of Washington. And, there's no question, there's so much value to the knowledge gained. No question. Like, I had one young resident that I worked with when he's a resident, and he did a fellowship in amputee. And man, he knows a lot about prosthetics and amputee stuff. And I mean, it's super helpful. That stuff that, you get into private practice or even busy in academics, and you get sub-focused in what you're doing. And to have somebody can come in that's your like content expert who you can roll back and ask questions is fabulous. I'm always amazed at just, how much detail and information people are getting in fellowships. Interventional stuff, you really have to have it, I think, to be effective in any kind of procedures these days and to be credentialed. But I think, the things that people are learning and doing in fellowship are so praiseworthy and so good. I was sort of surprised to see your numbers of how many people are doing fellowships, really surprised. I would imagine, a little bit that there's some frustration, when people come out with that. Like, I know I've been in touch with the resident who became the fellow who's doing the MPT. And, I imagine there's a little bit of frustration to have to like maybe round in a general rehab hospital and see strokes or whatever. But I would argue, that that's probably a good thing too, to keep your skills up. I think you and I, Mike, have seen this whole evolution of where, everybody was doing outpatient and sports and spine. And then, things changed, reimbursement changed, and it meant you had to be flexible. And I think that's why we're seeing people, and I'm grateful, that I've kind of kept my hand in a bunch of different things over the years, because the more skill sets we have and the more flexibility we have, the more opportunities there are. There may be only one or two opportunities in the country for someone that's doing 100% amputee, but if you can do a lot of other things, it opens up your options. And I think one of the things I would encourage everybody listening and anybody that, comes through residency and fellowship is, don't ever forget your physiatry generalist skills. The challenge with being a fellowship trained whatever is that if you only do what you learned in fellowship and lose the rest of your physiatry skills, you lose a lot of your marketability. Because sometimes it is problematic to be too sub-focused unless you really are an academic program install you're doing and you're doing research and you're doing clinics only exclusively for that. So that would be my thought. But it's great to see. I'm just so happy to see the evolution of our specialty and just, the smart people that are coming out and the great work that they're doing. And I think the challenge is a lot of the stuff we're talking about here, like marketing yourself and starting a practice and program development and team building. When you come out of a fellowship, you may not necessarily have learned those skill sets because it's already built for you.
Right.
You come out of a world-class spinal cord program and you're not, really, you didn't have to start it up or see what you had to do to get it to world-class. So it's a very different skill set, if you're going to be going into one of these new programs that you're trying to establish. So, it's interesting. I think we have a lot of work to do with teaching people those skills because we need physiatrists to be bold and strong and to be able to go into environments and, really set the tone and create the jobs for ourselves by showing people what we can do. And that's not something I'd be curious for any of the residents or fellows that are listening, how many feel comfortable with that, because I think some of that's personality, but a lot of it's just learned. So, and that's kind of our responsibility, I think, for us, at least at US Physiatry, is to help our team learn those things because it's not intuitive. And a lot of times you learn from mistakes, and hopefully we can teach people things from mistakes we made that they don't make the same mistakes. And we have a question from Katie. Let's see.
So the first part of her question was talking about RVUs. And so I gave my 2 cents I think you need to talk about benefits and RVUs and salaries as early as possible. And in private practice, I'd say I really enjoyed that everybody was much more upfront, and that was kind of very reasonable to talk about. In academics, I was often very frustrated. Some programs didn't want to talk about it. Some had different ways. But I think as early as you can, you need to really start talking about that to get the sense. Is this a RVU heavy program? Do they put a lot of value on that? I think that's important. The second part of our question is if you're considering joining a group with other specialties, I think everybody's, again, I gave all kinds of ups and downs, pros and cons. You've got to figure out if that group is the right fit for you. I will just say joining a group with other specialties, you have to make sure that they have some understanding of what physiatry does and where you want to fit in, as well as Dr. Smith said, what their needs are, because oftentimes those big groups are very good at expressing that, but don't understand what physiatrists fit in.
The other issue with RVUs, and it gets so complicated, some places, some groups, some entities calculate RVUs very carefully, and they're willing to share that information with you every month, right? And that's what you want, complete transparency. Other groups, not so much. So if I was going to give some advice, I would say, ask them, what's the transparency by which I'll be able to see my RVUs and get some background on how well they are processed to arrive at my salary?
Yeah.
And get that in the contract.
And working with a large hospital system, one of the things I learned from the inside out is sometimes, they have internal agendas in terms of how they define overhead and how their compensation model is. It's challenging because it can be very complicated. They may have the 3-bucket model where they look at your RVUs, they look at your medical directors and like call coverage dollars. And then the 3rd bucket is the value add to the system by saving them money and things like that. Some places it's straight up RVUs and they tell you what your overhead is. It can be really challenging because a lot of times, depending on how you're positioned, like your department or where you are, you may or may not have access to all that information or even the decisions of how they determine allocation of overhead. And I'll give you an example. When I was chair at a program, they were charging us to eat at the doctor's dining room, even though we weren't even based in that hospital, never used it. We were getting charged $300 an hour for a room for residents to meet. So every little thing I was getting nickel and dime for my department. And that was really challenging. But here's the other thing is if you're with other groups, so this is the fun part of this job, is a lot of times if you're with orthopedic surgeons and neurosurgeons and other people that create lots and lots of revenues, because it's just a fact that surgeons make a lot of money for systems, and they're always going to have disproportionate power in places that they need those revenues. If they have a surgery center or a hospital, they're counting on those big ticket items to help cover a lot of their overhead, and that's how they make their profits. So we have less power in a situation like that. But that being said, how you're positioned on a board can make a difference in how you're able to get information for yourself and your team, and how you can develop your income and reimbursement determinants. So for example, we had a board with 13 members. And it was heavily stacked between orthopedic surgeons and neurosurgeons. They were always in battle with each other. And I was the swing vote. And the night before board meetings, I was a very popular person because, they would ask how I was going to vote on things. And that was, of course, the perfect opportunity for me to ask for things for my department that were needed, so that we had, better allocation of overhead, or how our RVs were counted, or just getting credit for things that we were doing that brought money into the system. So a lot of this is politics. And I would say if you're going to join a group with other specialties, look at where the power is, look at whether your department, has a good position in that power structure and a voice and a say and a vote. Like look at the board memberships and see if there even is a physiatrist on it, because those are the kind of things that are going to affect your day-to-day and your reimbursement and your payment. It's just that simple. So yeah. And sometimes they're great, but sometimes not so much.
The other challenge with the surgical specialties, I think the main point is you need to, as Craig went, you need to decide what the culture of the group is. Do they want you there because they really want patient access to your skills and they want to improve the care of their group? Or do they want you there to generate revenues? Or is it for the group? Or is it somewhere in between? Because when it comes down to being a partner, because of the vast income differentials, it gets very hard for the highest earning surgeons to figure a way to get you in as a partner in the revenue and the way things are structured in revenue. There are different ways to structure it. That's what you have to find out. Are they really looking at making the group sustainable, looking at giving good care, efficient care, not too much, not too little, not too much surgery, not too little? Do they want your help in that? I think that's important to tease that out and going in that type of a power structure.
And also the job description. If you get asked by a group of orthopedic surgeons or spine surgeons, for a position, what do they really want you doing? Are you going to just be managing all the narcotics and the chronic pain surgical failures? Yeah. Or is the job description one where you're doing all the conservative care and there's an expectation you're going to find a percentage of people that end up being surgical candidates? And that's kind of your report card. Like, do you give them 20% of the people you see end up getting referred for surgery, or 30%? So you want to make sure you understand what they're asking you to do, because either of those situations could either be very miserable for your practice and what your day-to-day is, or potentially something ethically kind of borderline. So, finding out what their need is. Why are they hiring you? What do they want? huge, you know.
Well, thank you guys taking your evening out to have this discussion. And we'll close it out since we've gone way over the time we promised, but I think it was great. I appreciate everybody.
Yes, thanks, everyone. Thanks for the participants. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dr. Zerbeck.
Yeah.